G'day viewers. A friend has asked me to do a quick sort of back of the envelope guide to Wylde Smallsword. So here it is. So Wylde wrote the English Master of Defence, published in 1711. So he's the same kind of era as Donald MacBain and Sir William Hope. His book contains the true art of single rapier or smallsword. And like Hope and MacBain, he uses rapier and smallsword interchangeably. So first thing to talk about is the weapon itself. It was not what most people think of as a smallsword, as in sort of a classic late 18th century, early 19th century, triangular blade, very thin, very light type smallsword. He was using a transitional weapon that was really quite substantial. If you remember, we did a video last year called Trip to Lens, where I got to play with some antique weapons, including a smallsword of this era. So it's really quite a substantial weapon. This is a reproduction of it. There is some evidence that technically rapier meant a flat blade, smallsword meant a triangular blade, but really all the sources of this era are terribly inconsistent in the terminology they use. It's like they didn't really care if the blade was flat or triangular. It was still a rapier or a smallsword. So this is the weapon. So Wylde's guard is a medium guard, fully extended, aimed, he says, at your opponent's right pack, so inclined slightly to the outside, but he also talks about being engaged in cast, so it's perfectly acceptable to be engaged on the inside. It's straight out at me, medium guard. So it looks a little bit disgrazer-like until you realise he also says that you want to crouch low. So rather than being upright with our point at our opponent like so, we want to have our left knee very bent, our right knee slightly less bent, and he specifies that the knee wants to be over the right toe. He says some masters teach a straight leg, but he prefers this, but this leg more bent. So I'm going to be slightly back weighted, and my sword is going to be here. So this is a very, very extended guard, and we are engaged in a very, very narrow cross here. Okay? Now, this is very similar to the stance that Sir William Hope uses in Scott's Fencing Master, which is right down here as well. And Hope says the reason he says, yes, it's really awkward and you've got to get used to it, but the reason you use it is that it removes the lower targets as viable targets. And Hope even specifies, I used to have problems dealing with attacks underneath my sword, and so I started crouching down low to remove those as targets. Wylde says pretty much the same thing, and that he says, make sure all your thrusts are aimed at what he calls the killing parts. So, the head and chest, and he says if you drop your point underneath, you do so at great hazard to yourself. So he's saying much the same thing as Hope about crouching low, which basically means that there's no low targets that are worth going for, and you don't got to worry about the high one. Now the attacks, he says, should be made as close to the opponent's shell as possible. Okay, and we've really only got two, terse on the outside and cart on the inside. He does mention that you can engage your opponent's foible in terse and push through, like so. Hope talks about this as well. Hope calls it a plain thrust. Wylde says in one breath it's really cool, and then he says, but it's really dangerous. Don't do it. Hope says much the same thing. Hope basically says plain thrusts simply don't work. They work in the fencing cell, your master will let you do it, but should you try it in real life, it won't work to 1 in 6 times. So your default thrusts are going to be made down here, close to your opponent's shell, either on the inside or the outside, and he expects thrusts on both lines from either engagement. So if I'm crossed in terse, I can be attacked like so, or I can be attacked like so. If I'm engaged in cart, I can also be attacked on the inside or the outside. So this really is a medium guard, and it doesn't fully close either line. So Wylde's primary parry is what he calls the crosswise parry. And the crosswise parry, we cross on the outside to start with, so that's the way. So if you deliver a thrust on my outside, I do this. If you disengage and do a thrust on the inside, I do this. So what I'm doing is basically turning the doorknob, turning my hand one way or the other, keeping my hand exactly in place and simply deflecting like so. Okay? So this is a crosswise parry. And the cool thing about it is that it basically closes both your inside and outside lines at once. So if you can feint to my inside then go to my outside, you can see, okay, let's do it at an angle. As you thrust on this side, I make my crosswise parry to my inside, which forms an outside parry or terse parry on the other side. If you thrust to my outside and I parry like so, it forms an inside parry or cart parry for the inside line. And so the crosswise parry is really neat because it's almost entirely feint proof, which is really cool. Now it's not unique to Wylde. In Pallas Armata, this would be called, if you thrust here, cart on the outside. If you thrust here, terse on the inside. Pallas Armata specifies that you move a foot. Wylde doesn't mention so we assume he doesn't expect you to. But if you do move a foot, it does help to minimise the hand movement even further, to make those parries even smaller. So it's not unique to Wylde, it's found in other British systems as well. In addition, you get all the sorts of normal parries that you would expect in a small sword system of this type. So if you thrust there, I can do a simple outside parry like so. I can also do another thrust. Circular parries. And in fact, this very narrow crossing of the blade really lends itself really nicely to the circular parry, because all I've got to do is a very small circle around my opponent's hilt, like that. Now, Wylde also combines the circular parry with the false edge crosswise parry to do some pretty cool stuff. So we're going to be crossed on the outside, you disengage and thrust to the inside, and rather than just coming to here, I'm going to do this. So I'm going to disengage, as you disengage this, I follow him around, and coming up, turn the false edge to form my crosswise parry that way. Boom. So we've got simple parries, circular parries, crosswise parries, and also the half circle parries. Down to there, on the other side, that way, and that way. So all the sorts of parries you'd expect to find in a small sword system of the era are in there as well, but the crosswise parry is Wylde's preferred parry. Possibly his favourite parry of all is the half-moon parry, which he says is the most perfect parry that has ever been invented, and he says, without modesty, he's the only man who has ever invented it. Okay, so what the hell is a half-moon parry? So, what he says is you drop your point a couple of inches to your inside. You are inviting a thrust, obviously. When your opponent does it, you come back up, and then you can kill him. You can just drop it to the outside, and put it back to its former place, and then you kill him. So it's basically just a false edge deflection up on that line. So, not very exciting, but it is very close to the universal parry. Wylde did not invent it, but he did invent the name for it, called half-moon parry. He also uses a hanging guard, which he calls the falloon posture, which seems to be over to the inside line here, not dissimilar to Hope's hanging guard, inviting a thrust to the inside, which he can parry like that, and then riposte cartwise. He's quite big on the use of the left hand as a parrying device, so it's quite rapierish in that way, in that he's got a lot of guards. So against the same thing, he says, well, I can simply use the left hand in order to parry. Now the ripostes from our basic parries. So you can thrust to the inside. From here, I make my crosswise parry, and then I've got to turn my rapier back in order to deliver my thrust. Okay? So I'm parrying crosswise or terse on the inside, then riposting in cart. On the other side, if you thrust on my outside, I've got a choice. I can parry in cart and riposte in terse, and this gives me control of my opponent's sword while I'm doing it. But he says quite specifically that you may use cart in place of terse, but not terse in place of cart. Why does that mean? It means that on the terse side here, having made this parry, he said you can then pass in with a thrust in cart to your opponent's armpit. Boom. Like so. Okay? So having turned my hand to cart for my crosswise parry, I keep it there and riposte. Boom, 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 anywhere down there. Which is pretty cool. It, however, does not work on the other side. If I parry crosswise that way, and I try and riposte, leave your sword where it is, without turning my hand, I'm using terse in place of cart, as you can see, this is pretty damn dodgy. Okay, this is going to end in contretemps. So he says, do not do this. This is no good. But on the other side, I do not need to then turn my hand back. I can simply keep it in cart and kill my opponent from there. Similar to the half-move parry, he says you can drop your point way back down here. Again, invite the thrust and pull it back up there with that false edge. So he's quite keen on this line of riposte. So that's really Wylde in a nutshell. Get down low, straight out in a medium guard, keeping your hand here as much as possible. Whatever thrust your opponent makes, form a crosswise parry, and then kill them. You may keep your hand in cart if you are moving to your opponent's outside. On the inside, you must turn it back in order to retain control of their sword as you hit them.